Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and he drowned after saying Amen, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K., Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. He drowned after saying Amen. He was still holding the rosary when his mouth filled with water, and the last word he ever spoke, Amen, escaped as a bubble, rising silently to the surface of the baptismal font where he died. The body of Reverend Silas Roke was found at dawn, face down in the holy water, his cassock soaked, one shoe missing, and his fingers locked tightly in prayer. No one could explain how a grown man had drowned in a basin no deeper than a child's bath. The church doors had been locked from the inside. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no screams. And yet, he was dead. Father Brown arrived at St. Marrow's not because he was summoned, but because he couldn't sleep. He'd felt something. Not quite a dream. More like a memory being rewritten. He'd awoken just before sunrise, dressed slowly, and walked in silence across the dew-covered fields. He would later say it wasn't his mind that drew him there, but something far older, a pattern, perhaps, that had broken. Outside the chapel, the birds refused to sing. Inside, there was only silence, broken by the irregular dripping of water. The sight of Reverend Roke's body was horrifying. It wasn't just death, it was the expression. His face was frozen in terror, as if he'd seen something unspeakable in those final seconds. But that wasn't what struck Father Brown hardest. It was the way the man's knuckles were white, clenched around the wooden rosary, as though he wasn't praying for peace, but to be forgiven for something far worse. The police had theories, all of them dull. Perhaps he slipped. Perhaps he was ill. Perhaps it was suicide. But suicide didn't explain the locked doors. Suicide didn't explain the fact that his sermon notes, found beside the pulpit, had been ripped apart. Not torn in panic, but deliberately shredded into perfect, even squares, and placed in a neat pile, like a ritual. It was only Father Brown who noticed that the crucifix above the altar had been turned upside down. There was no sign of forced entry, no blood, no struggle, just that slow, maddening drip of holy water from the font, as though something had been washed away. And that's when things got worse, because Father Brown didn't ask, who killed him? He asked, why did he drown himself at the font instead of the river? And more chillingly, what did he think he was confessing to before he died? The villagers didn't speak openly about Reverend Roke. They were polite, cordial, respectful, but too quiet, too careful. And it was then that Father Brown began to see it, not a murder, but a pact of silence. The widow, Abigail Clay, who sat on the first pew every Sunday, wouldn't look him in the eye. She trembled whenever the bell rang. Her hands were never still. When Father Brown asked her, gently, "Did you hear anything that night?" she only whispered, "I heard the organ playing by itself." The organ hadn't worked in years. Its pipes were corroded, keys half broken. The church had no electricity. So how had she heard music? When Father Brown returned to the chapel that evening, alone, the scent of myrrh was still faint in the air. The candles had burned lower than they should have. And the font, though cleaned that morning, was still damp around the base, like something refused to stay dry. He didn't pray. He stood in silence for hours, watching. And then he found it. Not a clue, not evidence, a single drop of red wax beneath the altar. But the church hadn't used red candles in years. He followed the trail, not physical, but psychological. He visited the old bell tower, long abandoned, climbed it slowly, hand over hand, listening for creaks in the stone, for wind that didn't belong. And there, at the top, was something so profoundly out of place, it felt fictional, a child's shoe. A child's shoe wrapped in a silk cloth, stained with oil, and beneath it, scratched into the stone wall, a single Latin phrase. In aqua, peccatum lavatur. In water, sin is washed away. Father Brown felt cold down to the bone. The next day, Abigail Clay was found outside her cottage, staring at her well. She hadn't spoken in hours. Her mouth was dry. Her eyes were vacant. All she said was, "I thought he would save us." And then, he said it would be clean. The case should have closed, but it didn't, because that night, the baptismal font overflowed, even though the water supply had been cut. And written in steam across the stained glass window were 4 words: "I never finished confessing." That's when Father Brown realized something deeper, something spiritual had been disturbed. He didn't go to the police. He went to the confessional and waited. 3 nights passed. On the 4th, he heard it. A shuffling. Slow, deliberate. The confessional door opened, but no one entered. Then, the voice, low, wet, like someone speaking underwater. "He made us drink it. He said it would make us pure." Father Brown held his breath. "Who?" he asked softly. The voice replied, "Reverend Roque. Before the others, before the river took them." The door slammed shut. When Father Brown opened it, there was no one there, but the seat was wet, the floor damp, and the smell, not water, but vinegar and rust. He stayed up the rest of the night, writing, drawing, mapping connections that didn't make sense. The next morning, he asked to see the church records from 14 years ago. There had been 5 missing baptism entries, all infants, never registered, never named. One of them, he discovered, was the stillborn child of Abigail Clay. But the priest who performed the baptisms wasn't Reverend Roque. It was the man before him, Father Ellison. Dead, or rather, disappeared, drowned, in the river, never found. And Father Brown said quietly to himself, "We have not 1 drowning, but 2. He returned to the church with a question no one wanted to ask. What if the font wasn't just water? What if something had been added to it? What if Reverend Roque had, in his final moments, attempted to purify himself of something that could not be undone? The torn sermon notes were no longer random. Father Brown pieced them together using the order of their rips. They weren't notes at all. They were names, 5 of them. And one phrase, "I cannot bury this alone." Father Brown stood in the center of the church, now empty, now echoing, and whispered, it wasn't just guilt. He thought something was still alive. The next morning, villagers found the holy water turned black. Tests revealed it wasn't just water, it was laced with iron and small amounts of arsenic. Enough to paralyze, not enough to kill, unless you were already in shock, which meant Reverend Roque hadn't drowned by accident, nor was it suicide. He had been silenced by something or someone who wanted him to believe he deserved to die. But the most chilling revelation was yet to come, because Father Brown finally entered the rectory where Reverend Roke had lived. Dust everywhere. Silence. And on the bedroom mirror, written in fogged breath, "He forgave too late." Father Brown sat at the edge of the bed and looked at the portrait hanging above the desk. It wasn't of Christ. It was of a woman, pale, wide-eyed, dressed in black, and her eyes were missing, not scratched out, removed, cleanly. There was a slip of parchment tucked behind the frame. It simply read, "You baptized what should not have been born." And that's when Father Brown said the most terrifying words of all. "I know who did it." But the truth will never be told, because some truths aren't criminal. They're spiritual violations, and the dead, they don't always stay buried. That night, the font was filled with salt, the doors sealed, and no one ever stepped inside St. Marrow's chapel again, except Father Brown, once alone. He walked out an hour later, his hands trembling, his collar undone, and his eyes, for the first time, unreadable. He never spoke of what he saw inside, but he never took communion again. Chapter 2. Confession ended with sudden screams. He barely whispered the words, "Forgive me, Father," before something in the darkness ripped him from the confessional, and his throat opened before the prayer could end. The scream that followed wasn't human. It was too deep, too wet, and it came not from the penitent, but from the priest's side of the booth. No one inside St. Luke's that evening would ever forget the sound. Not the woman polishing the candlesticks, not the old man lighting incense, and certainly not the child who turned at the exact moment the confessional curtains snapped shut on nothing but blood and silence. The man who entered to confess, he never came out. The priest who was to absolve him wasn't seen again. The floor beneath the confessional remained soaked, even days later, even after it had been scrubbed a dozen times. And though the booth itself was burned and removed, those who enter the chapel at twilight still say they hear whispers, unfinished confessions, muttered apologies, the quiet rattle of rosary beads grinding against wood. Father Brown arrived 3 days later, not by invitation, but by instinct. He'd received no letter, no telegram. He simply woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, knowing one thing with chilling clarity: someone had confessed something they weren't supposed to, and the silence that followed wasn't justice, it was containment. The village was sealed shut in its own secrecy. No one wanted to speak of what happened. Father Alban, the man who had disappeared, was not officially listed as missing. His personal items were untouched, his bed made, but his dog, an old collie named Rufus, had torn apart the rug in the rectory hallway and refused to eat. The dog barked at corners where no one stood. He stared at the walls like they were bleeding. Father Brown visited the church at dusk. The moment he stepped through the doors, he felt it, not fear, but a shift, as if the air itself had a memory it wanted to forget. The floor where the confessional once stood was covered by a velvet curtain, but he could still see the stains underneath, not just blood, burn marks. He turned to the altar, and his eyes immediately caught something no one else had bothered to move. A single red candle, burned down to the base, left standing beneath the crucifix. But the wax at the bottom wasn't just melted, it was shaped into a circle. And in that circle, pressed carefully into the wax, were 5 fingerprints, small, child-sized. But there hadn't been children at that mass, not officially. Father Brown knew better than to chase ghosts, but what disturbed him most was the confession logbook, still open, left on the side table beside the vestry. The last entry was dated the night of the incident, but the name had been scratched out. Not blacked, not erased, but gouged from the page. And next to it, a strange note in red ink. I couldn't finish. He saw. The pen used to write the sentence wasn't found, but the ink, that wasn't ink. It was tested. It was blood. And yet the blood was not human. Father Brown spent the night in the chapel, not to investigate, but to wait. And at midnight, the bells rang. 13 times. There was no explanation for that. The bell tower only had one functioning rope. The mechanism was broken. But the sound echoed through the village, louder than any clock should have allowed, and with it came a sound beneath the pews. Scratching. Not rats. Fingernails. The next morning, one of the altar boys, Michael, confessed to hearing the voice. Not just once. Every evening since the murder. It says the same thing, he told Father Brown, shaking. It says, say it out loud, or I will. Father Brown asked the boy what it wanted him to confess. The boy wouldn't say, but he kept pulling at his collar, as if something invisible was tightening. Later that afternoon, Father Brown visited the old records of St. Luke's. He found something deeply disturbing. Father Alban, the priest who vanished, had heard only one confession before he died. The scratched-out name, but decades ago, another Father Alban, his grandfather, had also vanished, in the exact same booth. The date, exactly 33 years to the day, and both entries were scratched out. The pattern was undeniable, but the motive was madness. Because this wasn't about murder. Not really. It was about something that couldn't be forgiven. Something so dark that even the act of confession was a trigger, a key that opened a door no one should ever unlock. That evening, a letter arrived at the rectory. No name, no stamp, just a folded piece of parchment slipped beneath the chapel door. Inside was one line. He said it, I screamed. The handwriting was familiar, not recent. It matched a journal entry from 1904, written by a nun who had gone blind shortly before leaping from the bell tower. She'd written, "They think confession saves the soul, but sometimes it sets something else free." Father Brown's faith was unshakable, but he was not a fool. He returned to the chapel alone. Midnight, again. Sat in the newly placed confessional, directly across from the velvet-covered spot. He left the door open and waited. The candle above the altar flickered. The air grew impossibly still. And then the other side opened. No one stepped in, but the booth grew colder, and he heard the voice. Not a whisper, not a man, a presence. I told him what I did. He tried to forgive me, so I made him listen. Father Brown didn't speak. The voice continued. He screamed halfway through. That's when it started bleeding. Father Brown's mouth was dry, his breath shallow. "What did you tell him?" he asked. Silence. Then the voice said, "I said his name." Father Brown opened the curtain. No one was there, but beneath the seat, carved into the wood with a fingernail, was the missing name, half scratched, half preserved. It was his own. Brown. And beside it, another phrase, "You already heard me once." The booth slammed shut behind him. The candle went out, and when Father Brown awoke, on the floor, alone, shaking, his ears were still ringing. He wasn't sure if it had been a voice at all, or just something the church remembered too well. He left the chapel with a single sentence, "Someone's confession is echoing through time." The village pretended nothing had happened. Father Brown didn't push. He simply looked at the boy, Michael, and asked, Do you know what sin wants most? The boy shook his head. An audience, Father Brown said, but that doesn't mean we need to listen. That night, the chapel caught fire. No one saw who lit it. But the confessional didn't burn. It was left standing, perfect, untouched. And when the villagers came to witness the ruins, they found something drawn into the ash, just behind the altar, a perfect circle, and 5 small fingerprints inside. To this day, no priest has served again in that parish. And no confessions are heard aloud, only written ones, slipped silently into a box, never read, never answered. Because whatever was said that night, whatever was heard, didn't want forgiveness. It wanted to be remembered. And Father Brown, when asked what he believed had happened, simply said, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And with that, he left the village and never spoke of St. Luke's again. Chapter 3. Father Brown buried a secret. They found him in the cemetery at midnight, barefoot, trembling, and digging with his bare hands. But the coffin he uncovered didn't belong to the dead. It was Father Brown's. The grave was real. The nameplate hammered in, the soil still fresh. And the coffin inside wasn't empty. It was filled with letters, hundreds of them, sealed, stacked, and bound in black twine. No stamps, no addresses, just a single word written in red ink on each envelope: forgive. When questioned, Father Brown said nothing. He refused to explain why he was in the graveyard, why the headstone bore his name, or why the coffin had been buried without any record in the parish logs. The only thing he whispered to himself was, "It's waking up again." The villagers said it started with the sound, a bell tolling at the wrong hour. Always 3 chimes, always between midnight and 1. There was no bell scheduled to ring at that time, and the church tower had been locked for weeks due to repairs. But the sound echoed through the village like something calling out from a place it didn't belong. A week earlier, a young woman had vanished. Sarah Lyle, 26, choir soprano, vanished the night after her confession. No signs of struggle. Her last known words, overheard by the sacristan, were, "He said, I wasn't the first." The police searched the chapel, the pews, the choir loft, but they never looked beneath the floorboards behind the altar. Father Brown did, and what he found there changed him. Not a body, not blood, a wooden box filled with teeth. Teeth, polished, labeled, each with a slip of paper tied around its root, each labeled with a sin: envy, lust, betrayal, theft, pride. And at the bottom, one final tooth, so small it looked like it belonged to a child. Its label read, "Obedience." Father Brown took the box and said nothing to anyone. But that night, he walked alone to the cemetery, opened the grave with a rusted spade, and buried the box beneath his own name. Because he knew something the others didn't. The sins weren't just written on paper. They were memorized. Someone was collecting them. And worse, someone was using them. The letters in the coffin weren't written by Father Brown, at least not recently. They were dated decades ago, handwritten in ink that had faded to rust. But the writing was undeniably his. He had written them all, each a confession to something he had witnessed, but never stopped, each addressed to a person who had already died. He was burying not just paper, but evidence. And then Sarah's body was found, not in a river, not in a ditch, inside the chapel, behind the organ. Her eyes were open, her mouth filled with dirt, her hands folded in prayer, a rosary placed backward around her throat, its crucifix embedded in her skin. and carved into the back of the pew. In front of her, she sang too clearly. There were no footprints, no signs of forced entry, but someone had lit every candle in the chapel, all 36, and stacked beside Sarah's body were 6 envelopes, all sealed, all blank, all unopened. Father Brown refused to bless the body. He refused to perform the rites. He simply said, "I can't lie to the dead twice." And the villagers began to whisper, because some of them remembered a similar death years ago. Same chapel, same candles, same silence. A boy that time, found behind the pulpit, clutching a hymnal, eyes wide open. The church called it an accident. The newspapers called it a seizure. But Father Brown had known the truth even then. The boy had been silenced because he'd seen something, or worse, heard it. Now, after Sarah's death, Father Brown began acting strange. He didn't preach. He didn't visit. He began writing again. Late into the night, dozens of letters. Each one ended the same way. I saw it. I said nothing. When asked who he was writing to, he replied, "To everyone I failed." And then he said something even more terrifying. I think one of them wrote back, because 2 days later, a new envelope appeared in the rectory, not sealed, open. Inside, a single photograph, black and white, a picture of Father Brown as a young priest. But behind him, a figure, shadowed, faceless, wearing a cassock identical to his. The photo hadn't been taken in this world. The timestamp on the back read, Sunday, 12:03 a.m. From beneath. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. He didn't speak for 2 days. Then he locked the chapel doors and disappeared. No one saw him for 48 hours. When he returned, his hands were stained red, his eyes bloodshot, and his voice, low, gravelly, unlike his own, said, "The silence is not empty. It's listening." The villagers began to panic. 2 more people disappeared. Both had recently confessed. Neither had shared what they'd said, and both had received anonymous letters left on their doors, marked with a wax seal, a crucifix upside down. Each letter contained just one phrase, "You told the wrong priest." And that's when it hit Father Brown. It wasn't that the confessions were dangerous, it was who was listening. Someone or something was collecting sins, not to forgive, but to punish. A counterfeit priest, a shadow in a collar, hearing what only God should hear, and using it. Father Brown revisited every old confessional he could find, churches from decades past, abandoned parishes, sealed cathedrals, and in one, beneath a collapsed staircase, he found a second box, identical to the one he had buried. But this one was full. Inside, names, all etched in bone, each carved meticulously, spine fragments turned into name tags, dates, sins, even penances. But none of the penances had been completed, because they were all dead. And at the very bottom, one final bone, his own, carved with a sin he had never spoken aloud. Cowardice. That night, Father Brown returned to the grave, dug it up with shaking hands. The letters were gone. In their place, ashes, and on the inside of the coffin lid, scrawled in soot, "You confessed too late." The next morning, the chapel burned to the ground. The flames were blue. The fire department found no fuel source, no matches, no natural cause, but they found a single object in the ash that didn't burn. A confession box, unscorched, unopened. When they forced it open, it was empty, except for a note, written in Father Brown's handwriting. But he swore he hadn't written it. The note read, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And below that, scrawled in a different hand, "Because you buried it." Father Brown left the village that night. No farewell sermon, no luggage. He walked barefoot across the road, his collar unfastened, his pockets empty, and those who saw him last said one thing that still keeps them up at night. He was humming a lullaby, the same lullaby Sarah used to sing before Mass. But she had never shared that tune with anyone, not even in confession. Chapter 4. The candle burned before murder. The candle was already lit when they found the body, but no one in the church had lit it, and the wick had been burning for exactly 9 minutes, the same time it took for the victim's heart to stop. It wasn't the blood that disturbed Father Brown. It was the flame, steady, calm, undisturbed, burning beside the altar, where no service was scheduled, no vigil was planned, and no soul had come to pray. The church had been locked from the outside. The congregation had left hours earlier, and yet the flame flickered as though it had witnessed something it didn't want to remember. The body was that of Dr. Malcolm Hensley, a skeptic, a man who never once stepped foot in a chapel unless it was to scoff at superstition. He was found on his knees, arms outstretched, mouth frozen mid-sentence, as though trying to cry out something too late. There were no wounds, no trauma, no signs of struggle, yet his eyes were wide open, pupils dilated, veins in his forehead bulging like he had seen something no man was meant to see. In his hand, he clutched a match, unused. Father Brown arrived not because he was called, but because he had seen the flame from the rectory window. That single burning candle had no right to be alive, and yet it was glowing in the darkness, silent and waiting. He entered the chapel alone. No officers yet, just the presence of something unsettled. He examined the match in Dr. Hensley's hand, and then he saw it. On the floor, beside the doctor's feet, were wax drippings, not just fresh, still warm, but they didn't belong to the candle currently burning. They were from a different candle, black wax, almost tar-like, something not sold in any shop. They traced a perfect circle beneath the body. Inside that circle were etched 3 letters, D.M.I. Father Brown knew Latin well, but those initials meant nothing to him, at least not yet. He examined the pews, each one untouched. Dust had settled evenly across the wood, except for one, the 4th pew, left side. A single handprint had disturbed the dust. Small, delicate. Not Dr. Hensley's, a woman's perhaps, but no fingerprints. Just a strange residue, oil mixed with soot, like someone had reached out with a hand that didn't belong to this world. The mystery deepened when the candle finally extinguished itself, without a breeze, without movement, as if it had simply decided to stop living. And at that exact moment, every candle in the sacristy cracked in half. No explanation, no heat, just the sound of wax splitting cleanly, and the smell of iron rising into the air. Father Brown asked a single question. Who was the candle waiting for? He began questioning the villagers. No one knew Dr. Hensley had returned to the village. He'd left years ago, excommunicated from polite society after a series of public arguments against the church, most notably one that involved Father Brown himself. The two had clashed on radio once. Dr. Hensley declared faith a sickness and accused Father Brown of hiding behind silence to cover crimes. That conversation had ended with Father Brown saying just one phrase: "Some things are buried because they must not rise again." Now the doctor had returned and died in the same church he claimed held no power. But the investigation led nowhere. The cause of death? Officially, cardiac arrest. Unofficially, the coroner said the body didn't respond like it should have. No rigor mortis, no blood pooling. It was as if the body didn't know it was dead. But Father Brown found something the others didn't. A small burn mark on the inside of Dr. Hensley's left wrist, a circle with 3 dots. The same shape as a symbol he'd once seen carved into the floor of a now-destroyed monastery in Belgium. A mark used during false exorcisms where cultists disguised as clergy would mimic holy rites to invoke, not expel, something older. But what had it to do with a candle? That answer came the next night, when a woman arrived at the chapel just before midnight. She wore a mourning veil, didn't speak, but placed a single candle, unlit, on the altar. Then she turned and left. Father Brown examined it. The candle was identical to the one found burning beside Dr. Hensley, but this one had scratches beneath the wax. He shaved it gently, layer by layer, and underneath, engraved into the wax, were words, names, dozens of them. Some he recognized, some long forgotten. And at the very bottom of the candle, beneath the wick itself, carved so deep it pierced the center: "Forgiveness is not allowed." The name at the top of the candle: Malcolm Hensley. And the name just beneath it: Father Brown. He didn't tell anyone. He simply placed the candle into a basin of holy water. It hissed and turned black instantly, as though fighting to stay intact. He removed it, placed it inside a lockbox, buried it behind the altar. But the next morning, the lockbox was gone, and in its place, resting silently in the basin, was a candle, burning. Father Brown didn't sleep. He searched records, combed through archives, tracked down anyone who might have known Dr. Hensley's connections. And then he found her, Eliza Veal, former patient, once institutionalized for claiming that her dreams bled into real life. She'd told doctors about a candle that burned before people died, a candle with names. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, given shock therapy, released, forgotten. Father Brown found her in a home 2 towns over. She was older now, fragile, but when she saw him, her eyes locked onto his collar, and she said, "Have you seen yours yet?" He asked what she meant. "The candle," she said. "It burns before murder. It shows you who's next." And then, almost lovingly, she added, "You can't blow it out, not until it's done watching." She reached into her bag and handed him a photograph. It showed a chapel. This chapel, St. Germain's. In the center of the photo, beside the altar, was a candle, burning. And in the front row, unmistakably seated, was Dr. Hensley, looking directly into the lens. The photo was dated 3 days before he died. Father Brown felt the chill of prophecy tighten around him. He returned to the chapel and sat alone. The flame was burning again. He didn't remember lighting it. He stared at it for hours, and then saw what he'd missed all along. The wax didn't melt downward, it melted inward. It was swallowing itself, devouring its own light. And in the final minutes before the wick burned out, it released a smell so potent, so sickeningly sweet. It reminded him of something he'd smelled only once before, in the confession box of a man who had died before his sin could be absolved. That scent wasn't candle wax. It was rot. The next day, a parishioner named Agnes did not return home after Mass. Her body was found in the bell tower, hanging, peacefully, her face serene. In her left hand, a candle, unburned. In her right, a note. It read, "He knows who lit it." The police blamed suicide. Father Brown knew better. He looked at the name beneath his on the candle engraving. It had changed. Now, beneath his name, was Agnes Thorne. He scratched the candle open again and saw the new name below hers, Eliza Veal. Then his own name. Twice. He ran to the rectory, opened every drawer, every box, tore up floorboards, no candles, no wax, nothing, until he opened his wardrobe. Inside, stacked neatly, 12 identical candles, all unburned, each with his name at the top, each waiting. And next to the candles, on a hook, was a matchbox, half used. He turned. Every mirror in the room had fogged. A message began appearing in the glass. One word, next. He blew out the lights, left the house, and vanished for 3 days. When he returned, he held no sermons, heard no confessions. He walked into the chapel, locked the door behind him, and did not come out until morning. The villagers who passed by that night said they saw something impossible. Through the window, Father Brown sat at the altar. Candles surrounded him, all burning, and in front of each candle, a name written on parchment. Not Latin, not English, something older, something wrong. But Father Brown wasn't reading the names, he was listening to them. They were speaking, and he was nodding. The next morning, the candles were gone. So were the parchments. And in the center of the altar, where the wax had pooled, a phrase had been burned into the wood. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And beneath it, smaller, harder to read, "Because he keeps lighting the flame." Father Brown never mentioned the candles again, but every week, just after midnight on Sunday, a single one appears, lit, waiting. Chapter 5. Blood was found beneath altar. They only discovered the blood because the floorboards wouldn't stop bleeding, thick, dark, and still warm, as if something beneath the altar was trying to claw its way back into the world. It had started with a scent, a strange metallic sweetness that wafted through the chapel, even when the doors were closed and the candles unlit. Parishioners dismissed it as wax, incense, or old wood. But Father Brown knew the smell of blood. And this wasn't just blood. It was fresh, impossible, and deliberate. The kind of blood that hadn't come from an accident or injury. The kind that had purpose. The first time he noticed it, he was alone, preparing for morning mass. The crucifix had tilted slightly. The candles wouldn't stay lit. But when he knelt to pray, he saw it. A drop, then another. Thick, syrupy, seeping from the edge of the altar, like the building itself had been wounded. He wiped it away. Minutes later, it returned. When he peeled back the altar cloth, the wood underneath was cracked, splintered, as if it had been gouged open with something sharp, something desperate. No bodies were missing. No one reported injuries, and yet the blood kept coming. It wasn't a stain. It flowed, quietly, secretly, only when no one else was looking. Father Brown kept it hidden. For 3 days, he tested the theory. He waited alone each night. He prayed, he sang, he left the doors unlocked. And each night, at exactly 3:07 a.m., the blood would appear again. Just one drop at first, then another, then a slow trickle that stopped the moment he lit the sanctuary candle. He didn't tell the police. He didn't speak to the bishop. He only returned to his notes. Because this wasn't the first time. 15 years earlier, in a remote convent in France, a similar incident had occurred. Blood found under a chapel floor, with no source, no victim, and no explanation. That church had burned down 3 days later. Father Brown remembered it well. He'd been there, but the fire hadn't started from arson or candlelight. It had started from beneath. Back at St. Thomas's, the villagers began to notice strange things. A boy named Henry stopped speaking after Sunday service. A woman fainted during confession, claiming she heard something behind the altar whispering her name. The organ played 2 notes out of key, notes that formed a minor third interval, known in some superstitions as the devil's harmony. And then the letters began arriving, unmarked, folded neatly beneath pews, slipped through the rectory door, all handwritten, no return address. Each began the same way. He remembers what you forgot. And each letter ended with a name. Some were alive. Some had died years ago. One had never been born. Father Brown took the letters and traced the handwriting. It didn't match anyone in the village. But one of the names, Agatha Lynn, struck something inside him. She had been a child, born still 20 years ago. Her name had never been spoken aloud. It wasn't registered in any book. Only her mother, Cecilia Lynn, would have remembered it. Cecilia had passed last year, but her grave was beneath the altar. That grave had never been marked. A private request, kept silent by the bishop. Father Brown himself had buried her. And he remembered now, when he dug the earth, the ground beneath was already wet, not with water, something else. He returned to the chapel at night, alone. He moved the altar stone. He pried open the wooden base, and beneath the boards he found it, a hollow space. Inside it, a child's dress, stained red. It had no dust, no sign of decay. It looked like it had just been placed there, and wrapped inside the dress, folded like a secret prayer, was a page torn from the Book of Psalms. But the words had been rewritten, rearranged, blasphemous. The blood of the innocent cries not to God, but to the one who listens from below. Father Brown said nothing. He placed the page into his pocket, closed the altar, and did not speak for the rest of the night. The next day, the windows of the church shattered all at once at 3:07 a.m. Every clock in the village froze at that time, and in the middle of the chapel floor, a message was scrawled in red: "Stop hiding her." People began leaving the church. Attendance fell. Rumors spread. Whispers that Father Brown had awakened something, that the altar had become a tomb. But he didn't stop. He returned beneath the chapel the next night, tore open the boards, and dug deeper. What he found was not a coffin. It was a well, a dry well, sealed with stone, but with something etched into the rim. A name, Agatha, and a date, July 11th, 1901. The child would have been over 100 years old, but the dress found inside the hollow space was modern. Father Brown didn't believe in ghosts, but he knew trauma leaves marks on people, on buildings, on stone. Something was wrong with time here, or with memory, or both. That night, a former gravedigger named Elias came forward, shaking, white as ash. He confessed something he had sworn never to speak aloud. 20 years ago, he'd been paid in cash by a man who never gave his name to dig a hole beneath the altar, not for a coffin, for something wrapped in cloth. The man had said, It must rest here, where forgiveness cannot reach. Elias had never looked, never asked questions, but when he placed the bundle into the earth, he swore he heard something cry out from inside it. Not a baby, a woman. Father Brown asked what happened after. Elias said, "The ground pulsed, like it was breathing, and then he fainted." Father Brown took no rest. He returned to the altar. This time, he did not stop digging. At the bottom of the well, buried beneath a rusted iron plate, he found it, a box. Inside the box, a journal, not his, not Elias's. It belonged to Cecilia Lynn, the mother of the stillborn child. But the journal's last entry was dated only 2 months ago, and it was written in fresh ink. The page read, "You buried me," but she opened her eyes. And beneath that, one more line. "Blood remembers what mercy forgets." The final entry had a drawing, a map of the chapel, a crack beneath the altar, a second name, Father Brown. When he stepped back, the altar split. A jagged fracture ran across the floor. The smell of blood returned, thick, oppressive, suffocating. And from beneath, a whisper, not in a voice, in a breath, 3 words. She was alive. Father Brown didn't leave the chapel for 3 days. When he finally emerged, he was pale, silent, and carrying a single rose plucked from the old graveyard behind the church. A grave had appeared there overnight. New earth, no headstone. He placed the rose on top, said nothing, and walked away. When asked what had happened, he replied only, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And beneath his breath, just before he turned from the camera, he whispered, "Because some blood keeps bleeding." Chapter 6. Father Brown forgot the killer. The first thing Father Brown remembered was the blood, and the second was that he had already solved the murder, but had no memory of who the killer was. They found him standing alone in the sacristy, fingers stained red, a rosary twisted into knots in his pocket, his eyes fixed blankly on the chalice before him. The name of the victim had already been written in the parish death book. The investigation had already concluded. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. And yet, somewhere between the night of the confession and the morning bell, the entire solution had vanished from his mind. Not a detail, not a clue. The entire identity of the killer, gone. He had known. He'd even written it down. The note had been sealed in his personal diary, locked in the drawer beneath his writing desk. But when the diary was opened, every page had been torn out, cleanly, without a trace of tearing, and the lock itself showed no damage. His only clue was his own shaky handwriting on the drawer's inner wall. "I can't remember, and that terrifies me more than knowing." The victim was Arthur Finch, a historian and former schoolteacher, found slumped forward in the second pew. No wounds, no sign of poisoning, just the smell of burnt paper lingering in the chapel. His spectacles were missing. His wristwatch had stopped at 2:13 a.m., and a note had been placed inside his breast pocket. The note had only one sentence. "He told me the truth." No one could determine what that meant, and Father Brown, usually the one who sees beyond the visible, was stricken. He could recall speaking to Arthur. He could recall hearing his confession. He even recalled writing something down immediately after. And then blank. He didn't recognize his own footsteps in the snow the following morning. He didn't recognize his own voice in the recording of the sermon he delivered just hours after the murder. And when he saw his own reflection, he said quietly, Why does it feel like I'm wearing someone else's face? The bishop advised rest. The constable suspected stress. But Father Brown knew the shape of guilt, and it didn't fit him this time. He wasn't guilty. He was being erased. He turned to the only place he could trust, the confessional. But when he entered, he found something even more disturbing than silence. On the inner wall, where parishioners placed their hand for comfort during confession, someone had carved a list of names. Not initials. Full names, 12 of them, all deceased, all people Father Brown had once absolved. And beneath the last name, Arthur Finch, was a single, chilling question. How many sins have you buried for us? The knife marks were fresh. That night, the candles wouldn't light. Every one of them sputtered and went out the moment he whispered the Lord's Prayer. He checked his own sermon notes. They were missing. Pages. He reread his old journals. Entire entries. Days. Weeks. Gone. Every memory tied to Arthur Finch was unraveling like thread in fire. And then he found the photo. It was slipped beneath his pillow in the rectory. A picture of him, taken without his knowledge, standing in the graveyard. In the photo, he held a shovel, and at his feet, a small box. There was no timestamp, no signature, just a sticky note pasted on the back. You already dug up the truth. You just didn't like what you found. He hadn't been in the graveyard. Or had he? His shoes were muddy. There was dirt beneath his nails. He began checking the graves. Each headstone, each flower pot, each plot of land. And then, at the back of the churchyard, beneath the weeping willow, he found it. A patch of freshly turned earth, unmarked. And when he dug, bare-handed, frantic, he found a second rosary. Not his identical, but older, worn, stained red. Attached to the rosary, a photograph of a woman, smiling, eyes scratched out, and beneath the photo, written in the same trembling hand as the note on Arthur Finch. She remembered. You forgot, and now she's quiet. But who was she? Father Brown didn't recognize her face, and yet he felt her name beneath his tongue. He couldn't speak it, couldn't pull it from the shadows of memory. He returned to the church, and for the first time in 20 years, he broke the seal of the dead. Confessional, a box that hadn't been opened since the fire of '38. Inside it, buried beneath ash and soot, was a tape recorder, still intact, and a single cassette labeled, "The One You Chose to Forget." He played it. At first, static, then whispers, then a voice, his own. If she ever speaks, everything ends. I can't let her live with it. I won't. She'll be buried, and so will the truth. Then silence. And then a second voice, one he did not recognize. I didn't ask you to kill. I asked you to listen. He dropped the recorder. It cracked on the floor. And when he looked back up at the altar, the words, "You forgot her," had been scrawled in red across the pulpit. And behind it, a mirror, one that had never been there before. It reflected not the chapel, but the well behind the church, where they had once sealed a confession box with cement. He ran there, tore the stone away. Inside, instead of ash, instead of scripture, a dress, folded, blood-stained, and sewn into the hem. A name, Eleanor. He fell to his knees. The name hit him like thunder. Eleanor Green, the girl who had gone missing years ago after accusing Arthur Finch of abuse. Her testimony had vanished, her file sealed. The church had called it delusion. She was never found, because she had been buried. But not just by Arthur Finch, by Father Brown, because he'd chosen to believe a friend, and forget a girl. And when Arthur confessed weeks ago, it had all come back to him, and he had written it down. The killer wasn't Arthur. The killer had been Eleanor's older brother, Samuel Green. He had murdered Arthur for what he did, for what the church allowed, for what Father Brown forgot. And now, Father Brown couldn't remember Samuel's face, couldn't remember what he looked like, what he wore, even where he lived. Because the moment the murder was solved, someone had taken the memory away. On purpose. He ran to the police, desperate, empty-handed. No evidence, no proof, just one photo, a woman's smile, a name in the hem of a dress, and his own voice on a broken tape, admitting he had buried the truth. The case was never reopened. The parishioners never spoke of Eleanor. The chapel was closed for repairs. And Father Brown, he stood before his shattered mirror and whispered to no one, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And then he paused, because I'm starting to forget it again. Chapter 7. Death waited behind church curtains. When Father Brown pulled back the curtain to begin Sunday Mass, he found a body hanging silently behind it, swaying in rhythm with the organ music that no one was playing. No one screamed. No one ran. The congregation simply froze, paralyzed, not from horror, but something stranger, recognition, as if every soul in the room had known, somehow, that death had been waiting behind the velvet all along, that it had always been standing there, patient, listening. The body belonged to Beatrice Gough, the church's beloved seamstress. She'd stitched every vestment, repaired every curtain, even tailored the altar cloths by hand. Devout, quiet, unfailingly kind. Beatrice was the last person anyone expected to die in that way, in that place. But what haunted Father Brown, more than the image of her lifeless body, was the thing tied to her left hand. A thread, red and frayed, stretched tightly into the folds of the curtain, and when they untied it, they found it continued inside, woven into the fabric itself, 17 feet of crimson thread, embedded into the curtain's hem, and at the end of it, in a tight knot, near the base of the velvet, a needle, bent, broken, and bloody. The police believed it was suicide. The chapel was locked from the inside. No signs of intrusion. But Beatrice was known for a phobia of heights, a terror of ropes, and a faith that forbade her from even watching violent plays. She'd once fainted during a reading from Revelation, hanging herself from the church curtain. Impossible. There was something else, something Father Brown didn't mention to the constable. Just hours before she died, Beatrice had come to confession. She said only one sentence. "There's something in the fabric." He'd thought she meant metaphorically, a turn of phrase, a poetic notion. But now, staring at the broken needle, the buried thread, and the curtain that moved too easily in a windless chapel, he realized she meant it literally. Father Brown began tracing Beatrice's last days. She'd been working late, alone in the vestry, repairing a hole in the communion cloth that no one remembered tearing. She had reportedly been more withdrawn, whispering to herself, scribbling notes into scraps of parchment and hiding them behind the hymnals. He found one. It was addressed to no one. "They told me it's in the folds, that if you listen close enough, you can hear it breathing." He ran his fingers over the curtain. The velvet was soft, but beneath the texture, something else. Raised stitching, not visible to the eye, a pattern woven into the fabric from behind. He peeled back a corner and gasped. Not a pattern. Words, old, faded, woven into the fibers. Latin, hand-stitched. Vestimentum confitetur peccatum. The vestment confesses sin. But who had written it? Who had stitched Latin confessions into the church curtain? He traced the origin of the fabric. The curtain had been donated years ago from an abbey that had burned down under mysterious circumstances. No records remained. No clergy survived. Just a salvage box of items passed from church to church. One of them, the curtain. And in every church it had entered, there had been a death. Always in silence. Always behind the curtain. And always, just after someone made confession. Father Brown didn't believe in cursed objects, but he believed in memory, in guilt. And some fabrics, like some people, remember things. That night, he stayed in the church. He lit a single candle. He stood before the curtain and listened. At first, nothing. Then a whisper, not from behind the curtain, from within it. It was not a word, not language. It was weeping, slow, labored, and far, far too human. He tore it down. With shaking hands, he cut into the seams. Inside the hem, tucked carefully between folds of velvet and thread, he found what no one should ever find in a place of worship. Hair, human, grey, curled into small clumps, sewn into the fabric like stuffing. And then, teeth, 5 of them, embedded where the drapery pleated, filed, yellowed, and each with a symbol etched into the enamel. One of the symbols he recognized from an exorcism case in Milan. It meant remembrance. Another symbol, unknown, a spiral, inverted. He gathered the curtain, folded it carefully, and locked it away in the cellar beneath the chapel. But the next morning, it was back, hanging, perfectly, and the needle, no longer broken, and the thread, fresh, uncut. Someone had re-sewn the entire thing overnight, but no one had keys to the cellar. No one had even known he'd moved the curtain. And this time, someone had added something new. At the base, stitched in black, "You'll forget me next." He turned to the pulpit. There, a fresh message burned into the wood. The dead behind the curtain must stay hidden. And beneath it, a name. Agnes. He didn't know anyone named Agnes. He checked the parish registry. There was no Agnes, until he checked the records from the abbey that burned down. One name survived, Sister Agnes Leroux. She disappeared the day the abbey burned, never found, until now, until the weeping began, until Beatrice died, until the needle reappeared in Father Brown's coat pocket without explanation. He didn't sleep for 3 nights. And then the dreams came, curtains closing, thread tightening, whispered prayers in reverse, and one phrase, over and over again, as if sewn into his brain. "Your sin is stitched into the silence." He wrote the bishop. No reply. He summoned help. The chapel remained quiet until Thursday, when the boy came, 10 years old. Stranger, no parents in sight. He walked into the church and pointed at the curtain. "That's where she lives now," he said. The woman with the mouth full of thread. When asked what he meant, the boy simply said, "She watches when people kneel. She watches when they close their eyes." Then he left. No one saw him again. That night, the candle wouldn't stay lit, and when Father Brown pulled back the curtain again, he saw her. Just for a moment, a flash of grey eyes, lips sewn shut, a figure standing, pressed, into the fabric itself. And then she vanished. No one believed him, but the next morning, a second name appeared, stitched at the bottom. Father Brown. He tried to burn the curtain. It wouldn't catch. He tried to cut it. The scissors snapped. He tried to leave. The doors were locked. From the outside, he knelt, exhausted, terrified. And the curtain swayed. No wind, no motion, just a slow, rhythmic sway. And then a third name appeared, beneath his yours. That night, he stood in the chapel alone and whispered, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. And behind the curtain, someone whispered it back. Chapter 8. She whispered before her execution. Just seconds before the rope snapped her neck, she leaned toward Father Brown and whispered, You're about to forget everything I told you. The priest's hands trembled as the trapdoor released. The sound was clean, too clean. The kind of sound that silences a crowd, not with horror, but with finality. And yet her words echoed louder in his mind than the thud of her body falling. A whisper so soft, so quiet, it should have faded, instantly. But it didn't. It stayed, circling like a storm. Her name was Lydia Maudlin, 32, convicted of poisoning her husband, their 2 daughters, and the parish deacon. A village scandal of such proportion, it swallowed everyone it touched. The evidence had been damning. Her confession, written in her own hand, the vials found buried in her garden, the ledger detailing the doses, and worst of all, her silence during the trial. Not once did she protest. Not once did she cry. She simply smiled. Until the night before her execution. That was when she requested Father Brown. The warden was reluctant. Lydia hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, and what few words she did utter were disjointed, strange. But Father Brown came anyway, traveling through fog and sleet to reach the prison, arriving just past midnight. He sat across from her, but she didn't lift her head. She simply whispered a name he hadn't heard in 30 years, a name that didn't belong in her mouth, a name he himself had buried. He froze. Then she whispered another, this one not a name, but a date, one that hadn't been spoken aloud since the chapel fire that left half the village scorched in guilt and no official cause. She smiled again and said softly, They think I killed the wrong people. But the truth is, I killed for the right one. That was all. She never confessed again. But that night, Father Brown didn't sleep. The next morning, during the final rites, she pulled him close and whispered the line that would haunt him more than any sermon ever could. You're about to forget everything I told you. And then snap, he blinked and forgot. It didn't happen instantly, but slowly, like a thread pulling loose from the edge of a tapestry. He remembered her voice, but not the words. He remembered the names she spoke, but not what they meant. He remembered the candle burning beside her bed, but not why it made him shudder. Back in Kembleford, things should have gone back to normal. They didn't, because the church bell began ringing at 3:19 a.m., the precise moment of her death. Not once, but 8 times. Once for each letter in her name. Lydia Maudlin. Father Brown took it as coincidence, until he returned to his study and found the candle. The same candle that had burned beside her bed. Unlit, but still warm. And beside it, a note in unfamiliar handwriting. You listened, but you didn't hear. He didn't remember bringing the candle with him. He didn't remember the walk home. He didn't even remember leaving the execution chamber. He checked his diary. The last 3 pages were missing. torn clean, but not gone. They'd been placed inside a hymnal in the pew where Lydia used to sit. He opened it, and what he read made him drop the book. 3 names, crossed out in black ink. Then another, his own, and beneath it, a single sentence in Lydia's unmistakable handwriting. You were there that night. The priest stumbled backward. That night, the chapel fire, he hadn't been there. He'd been sent away for retreat. Everyone knew that, but now he wasn't so sure, because suddenly he remembered something he shouldn't have forgotten. The smell of smoke on his collar, the feeling of ash in his lungs, and the sound of someone screaming his name, but in a voice too small, too young. He searched the archives, found the names of the children Lydia was accused of killing. 2 daughters, yes, but the names weren't hers. They were aliases, fabricated at birth, and buried without record. And the deacon, the one everyone swore she hated, he wasn't even ordained. He was a survivor, one of the orphans from the fire, one of 3. The other 2 were the children, Lydia's children, but not biologically. They were the ones she saved from the burning church. And the husband she killed, he had been the arsonist. He'd lit the match, he'd locked the doors, and Father Brown had absolved him before his death, never knowing the full truth. Now it came crashing down, because Lydia hadn't been a murderer. She'd been the last witness, and someone had made her disappear. He opened the candle, broke it in half. Inside, rolled like a secret, was a photo, black and white, a woman holding 2 children, their faces charred by time. But behind them, the chapel, before the fire, and standing just inside the door, blurry but visible, Father Brown. He had been there. He had watched them run. He had chosen to turn away. He had forgotten, or been made to forget. By whom? The bishop? The council? Or had he done it to himself? He visited the place where Lydia had been buried. There was no marker, just an unkempt patch of grass. No cross, no name, just a candle, burning. Again. He picked it up, cold, unlit, but in the wax, scratched, with a fingernail. She whispered, "Now scream." That night, the bell rang again, 19 times. 1 for each lie he'd ever buried. 1 for each name she whispered before the execution. Names he could no longer remember. Names that were starting to burn holes in the edge of his mind. He sat in the chapel, alone. He lit a match, stared at it, and whispered into the darkness, "I know who did it." The flame flickered, but the truth. He let the match burn his fingers. Will never be told. Chapter 9. Midnight Bell revealed a killer. The church bell rang 12 times at midnight, but there was no one in the bell tower, and the 12th chime ended with a scream. No one should have heard it. The tower had been sealed since the lightning strike last year. The bell ropes had been removed. The stairs had collapsed. There was no access, no explanation. And yet just as the clock struck 12, the whole village stopped. Even those deep asleep claimed to have sat bolt upright, heart pounding, ears ringing, as though the bell had entered their dreams or their conscience. Father Brown was the first to reach the church. He arrived barefoot, drawn by instinct. The doors were open, the air unnaturally cold, and the candle by the altar had tipped over, its wax spilled not in a drip, but in a perfect circle. In the center of that circle, a single footprint, bare and wet. No rain had fallen in days. He didn't speak, not at first. He simply walked the aisles staring up at the bell tower, knowing what the others refused to admit. The bell hadn't tolled by accident. It had been summoned. Later that morning, a body was discovered behind the apse wall. Not in a crypt, not in a grave, inside the wall itself. A cavity, plastered over decades ago, had cracked open. Inside, a skeleton, curled, crumbling, clutching a rosary that didn't belong to any priest in the registry. And etched into the bones, yes, the bones, were letters carved slowly, precisely, as if someone had written a message across their own ribs. The message: ring once for truth, ring twice for guilt, ring 12 times for justice. The 12th chime, Father Brown now understood, had not been a warning. It had been a sentence. He asked the villagers about the bell. Few remembered its history. One man, aged and mostly blind, said only this: it never rings alone. Someone always dies after the 12th. That same day, a letter was delivered to the rectory. No return address, sealed with wax, marked not with initials, but with a fingerprint. Inside, a single sentence: he killed me during confession. Father Brown examined the paper. The ink was not standard. It was old, faded, but it was recent, still damp, still breathing. That evening, he returned to the tower, forced his way through the rotted staircase, climbing hand over hand with only a lantern and his rosary. At the top, in the shadows, beneath the bell, he found something chilling. The dust had been disturbed, not once, but many times. Footsteps, small, bare, frequent, as if someone had been pacing, as if the bell had been rung from within. And on the wooden support beam, directly beneath the bell, burned into the grain with the tip of a candle: I know what you did. Father Brown stepped back, and above him, the bell shivered. No wind, no motion, just a soft, low hum. It was not metal. It was a voice, and it said a name no one had spoken in 25 years. Elias Crown, a former parish priest, presumed drowned in the river, but never found. Until now. The skeleton in the wall, the rosary matched Elias's, and the carvings. The last line etched across the hip bone read, Father Brown must choose who dies next. He stumbled back, down the broken stair, into the sanctuary. The next day, another letter. No envelope, no seal, pinned to the chapel door. He silenced her first. Now the bell speaks. Father Brown opened the church registry, looked for names associated with Elias Crown. One stood out: a young woman, Caroline Hale. Disappeared 2 years before Elias's drowning, never seen again. Her name scratched out of every logbook. No funeral, no confession, no memory. But her prayer card, missing all these years, was found beneath the pulpit, burned, half fused to the floor. And someone had scrawled across it in ash. She tolled the bell. That night, the bell rang once more. 12 chimes, 12 long echoes. And this time, when the last one ended, a woman screamed, but no one had died, not yet. Instead, the town's former mayor was found in his home, paralyzed, his eyes open, his mouth filled with dirt. On his desk, a letter. He buried her for the priest. But the bell never forgets. Father Brown could feel the circle tightening. The bell was not a symbol. It was a judge, each chime a heartbeat, each ring a revelation. And now it was ringing for him. He dug into the archives, deep, dangerous, found documents that had been buried beneath decades of silence. Elias Crown had been accused, secretly, of abuse. The report had been sent. It had reached the diocese, but the diocese had done nothing. Nothing except move him to St. Mary's, where Caroline Hale vanished 3 weeks later. No trial, no hearing, just a quiet transfer. And Father Brown, he had written a letter back then. He had warned the bishop, but the reply he received was cold, dismissive. Let sleeping bells lie. Now they were awake. He returned to the tower for the last time, and what he found confirmed everything. A second skeleton, smaller, curled beside the beam, wrapped in cloth, a pendant clutched in one tiny hand. Caroline's. Inside the pendant, a photo of Elias and a note. He promised silence, but she rang it anyway. The child had rung the bell, to tell, to scream, to warn. And Elias had sealed her there, and then sealed himself. And now, decades later, the bell was no longer silent. It rang for Elias, it rang for Caroline, and now it rang for Father Brown, because he had known and said nothing. He knelt in the chapel, he prayed, and as midnight struck, the bell rang once, then again, and again, until 12 echoed through the village like thunder. And when the final chime faded, there was a note on the altar addressed to Father Brown. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. And beneath it, in fresh ink, unless the bell rings, 13. Chapter 10. Last sermon ended in bloodshed. The moment Father Mallory said, Amen, his throat opened like paper, and blood splattered across the pulpit as though the sermon itself had cut him. No one moved. The congregation remained frozen, as if bound in place by the sheer impossibility of what they had just witnessed. He hadn't been attacked. No gunshot. No weapon. Just the word, Amen. And then the blood, pouring from his mouth, down his collar, across his chest, as he sank slowly to the floor beneath the altar where he'd preached for 40 years. The choir continued humming, unaware, as the organist's fingers kept moving across the keys in mechanical obedience. The priest had died, but the church, it didn't stop. Father Brown arrived 15 minutes later, called by a breathless altar boy who had seen everything but understood none of it. When he stepped inside Saint Raphael's, the first thing he noticed wasn't the body, it was the silence. That awful, weightless silence that exists only in rooms where something unnatural has happened. A stillness that doesn't feel like grief. It feels like something is waiting. The blood had soaked into the wood, pooling around the edges of the dais. The chalice remained upright. The Bible lay open to Psalm 94, though no one had turned to that page. Father Mallory had been speaking on forgiveness. He'd never made it to the closing lines. The last phrase he spoke, written in the margin of his sermon notes, was, "The truth is not mine to speak aloud." It didn't make sense. The death, the timing, the wound, it was all too surgical, too clean. The coroner said his vocal cords had torn from the inside out, not slit, ruptured, as if his own voice had killed him. Later that night, the church janitor uncovered a recording device hidden beneath the pulpit. It wasn't a mic for the service. It was old, analog, covered in dust, and the tape inside had been spliced. Father Brown listened. The tape contained only one sentence, repeated over and over again in Mallory's voice. I saw what was buried beneath the floor. I saw what no priest should see. Beneath the floor, Father Brown moved quickly. He returned to the pulpit, unlatched the front panel. Behind it, hidden for decades, was a hatch. Old, iron, sealed shut with nails black from rot. It took 2 hours to pry it open. Inside, he found steps, descending, beneath the altar, and at the bottom, a second chapel, stone, crumbling, lit by wax that should have burned out decades ago. The candles were melted to the floor in puddles of bone-colored wax. At the far end of the underground chapel stood a crucifix, not of Christ, but of something else. Something faceless, mouth sewn shut, arms bent backwards. Beneath it, a second pulpit, and carved into the stone. He who preaches below bleeds above. Father Brown understood nothing, until he found the second Bible, this one hand-bound in animal hide, pages blackened with ash and scrawled symbols. It wasn't a Bible, not truly. It was a record, names, dates, and one phrase written beside every entry. They spoke what should remain unspoken. Father Mallory's name was last, and beneath his name, he knew the final sermon. The next morning, the walls of the upper chapel began to sweat. No rain, no heat, just moisture, as if the stone itself was weeping. Parishioners reported hearing voices during Mass, whispers, Latin phrases, none that belonged to the liturgy. Father Brown began to suspect that the pulpit, the one Mallory had preached from, was cursed, but it wasn't. It was connected, a conduit, one step too close to the lower chapel. He returned to the underground space the following night and found something new, a fresh pool of Chapter 11. He vanished after Sunday Mass. He shook Father Brown's hand at the chapel door, smiled warmly, and said, "See you next Sunday." But by dusk, every trace of him was gone, as if the village had imagined him. The man's name was Benedict Allen, and he had sat in the third pew every Sunday for 6 years without fail. He arrived precisely 5 minutes before Mass, left precisely 2 minutes after, never missed a service, and never stayed to chat. He never took communion, never sang, and never once received a home visit. Yet he was liked, trusted, remembered, or so people thought, until he disappeared. That evening, as the last of the worshippers trickled out into the grey fog of Kembleford, Father Brown noticed something strange. The third pew was clean, too clean. No stray bulletins, no handprint on the polished wood, no scent of tobacco that usually lingered where Benedict sat. The cushion was still warm, but there was no indentation. It was like someone had just stood up, but not from that seat. And then Mrs. Calloway, the organist, asked an impossible question. "Who's the man in the third pew, the one with the green scarf? Has he joined recently?" Father Brown froze. Green scarf. Benedict always wore one. Every winter, every spring. But Mrs. Calloway had played the postlude for 6 years. How could she forget him? Father Brown asked around, first quietly, then more urgently. To his horror, most of the congregation either didn't know Benedict by name or remembered him incorrectly. Some claimed he sat in the back, others said he wore a blue coat. One woman insisted he was a visitor from London. And when Father Brown checked the parish registry, where names of frequent Mass attendees were scribbled beside the dates of their last confession, Benedict's name wasn't there. Not once. Not ever. The priest's stomach twisted, because he remembered Benedict clearly. His voice, his handshake, his quiet nods at the end of sermons. He'd even spoken with him about books, politics, the weather. Or had he? The vestry log, where he should have been signed in for the occasional parish meeting, was also blank. Benedict Allen had been there every Sunday, except he hadn't. The mystery worsened when Father Brown visited the small boarding house where Benedict supposedly lived, a red brick building at the edge of the village owned by a stern woman named Gertrude Smythe. When he asked about Mr. Allen, she blinked, slow and distant. "I've no tenant by that name." He described Benedict, the coat, the scarf, the soft voice, the books. She hesitated, then said, "There was a man, 2 years ago, quiet, room 5. Never came down for breakfast, never spoke much." Father Brown followed her up the stairs, every board creaking like bones underfoot. She opened the door to room 5 with a key that still hung on a rusted hook, labeled vacant. Inside, the room smelled of dust and lavender. The bed was made, the dresser untouched, but the closet held a single item, a green scarf, folded perfectly, and tucked beneath it a prayer card. One of Father Brown's, his signature on the back, dated 3 months prior. He didn't remember giving it to him. He didn't remember visiting that room. And when he checked the local post office for any letters or parcels addressed to Benedict Allen, they pulled out a small, unclaimed box, no return address. Inside, wrapped in linen, a rosary, one that had belonged to Father Brown himself, stolen 5 years ago. That rosary had been lost in a fire. How had Benedict come to possess it? And more importantly, why return it now? That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. He pored over his old journals, looked through sermon notes, checked funeral records. Nothing, not a single mention of Benedict Allen. It was as if someone or something had removed him from time, but not completely, because behind the altar, behind the dusty hymnals, someone had scratched a message into the wood. "I heard what you buried," and beneath it, a single word: "Remember." Father Brown felt it then, not fear, but shame, deep, old. He walked to the back of the church, to the locked cupboard where sealed confessions from the dead were kept, confessions never read unless permission had been granted. Inside were 3 envelopes, all unmarked, all yellowed with age. One of them had been opened. Inside, a note, not a confession, just one line, scrawled in trembling ink. "He came back to hear your answer." Father Brown fell to his knees, because he remembered now, not Benedict Allen, but the boy, the altar server, 18 years old, accused of theft, banished from the parish with no trial, no defense. Father Brown had signed the letter himself. He'd never seen the boy again, until now, until a man with the same eyes had shaken his hand and whispered, "See you next Sunday." The boy's name, Benjamin Allerton, not Benedict Allen. Same face, same voice, and now gone, erased again. The next Sunday, the 3rd pew was empty, permanently. But beneath the cushion, Father Brown found a folded piece of paper. "You let them condemn me. You spoke no truth. You offered no mercy. I waited in silence for years, and now I disappear again. Only this time, you'll feel it." And beneath the note, in faint pencil, "I forgive you." Father Brown trembled. He walked into the pulpit and could not preach. The words would not come. And as the congregation waited, expectant, confused, a wind passed through the chapel, cold, grieving, and in the 3rd pew, a faint indentation, just enough to hold the memory of someone no longer allowed to exist. That night, the bell rang once, not for the dead, not for the living, but for those in between. Father Brown sat alone in the chapel, holding the green scarf, and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. Only Father Brown heard screaming. Everyone claimed the church was silent that night, but Father Brown swore he heard screaming echoing from beneath the floor, long after the doors had been locked and the candles blown out. The sound didn't come from outside. It wasn't wind or foxes or tricks of an old man's failing mind. It came from the wood beneath the altar, rising through the stone, distant and raw, like someone buried alive. Or worse, not buried yet. He had just finished his evening prayers. Alone in the pews, everyone else had gone. Yet that scream, it was real. It was begging. It knew his name. He rushed toward the altar, heart pounding. Nothing. The air was still. The flicker of the sanctuary lamp offered no sign of disturbance. But the silence that followed, it was wrong. Not absence, but suppression. As if the scream had been muffled, forced back down beneath the earth. And he realized it then. Whatever had made that sound wasn't trying to escape. It was trying to warn him. The next morning, no one believed him. The sacristan smiled politely and said perhaps he'd fallen asleep and dreamed it. One of the nuns suggested it might be foxes in the crypt. The bishop didn't respond at all, but the villagers knew better. The chapel was ancient, older than anyone admitted, and something about its foundation had always made the locals uneasy. There were stories, of course, half-forgotten whispers about a sealed vault beneath the altar, closed during a plague, never opened again. Most dismissed them, until now, because the next night the screaming returned, but only Father Brown heard it. He sat alone, in the pew closest to the sanctuary, waiting for it. He timed it precisely. It came at 2:13 a.m., again and again, like a buried church bell tolling beneath the grave. This time it was louder, closer, clearer, a woman's voice, and it said, "You see the blood, but not the crime." He froze. Then it was gone. No one else heard it. Not the curate, not the cleaners. No recording devices picked it up. Only Father Brown's ears bled slightly the next morning. Just a trickle, enough to stain his pillow. He began digging into the history of the church, the blueprints, the renovations, but all the diagrams ended at the altar, nothing beneath it, as though no one dared acknowledge the crypt that was, by all intuition, absolutely there. The records from the 1600s were missing entirely. Burned in a filing accident, they claimed. He asked the oldest living villager, Agnes Willoughby, 99, silent for 20 years. When he said the word screaming, she blinked. When he said, beneath the altar, she whispered her first word in decades. Again, that was all, again. He returned that night. Determined, he brought tools. He moved the altar stone, tore back the cracked tile beneath it. The earth was dry, cold, but hollow. When he knocked, the sound came back twice, echoed. There was space below, a chamber, and as he pressed his ear to the floor, the screaming returned, but this time it said his name. Not shouted, spoken, whispered from below, and not once, but 12 times. He stumbled back. He called for help. No one came. The next day, strange things began to happen in the village. The well water turned black for 7 minutes at dawn. A child claimed to see a lady, made of smoke, standing behind the crucifix during Mass, and a note was found nailed to the chapel door. She was buried without confession. No signature, But the nail was old, hand-forged, the kind used 4 centuries ago. Father Brown began digging in the records of the plague years. Cross-referencing burials, one grave stood out, unmarked, listed only as the heretic. No location given, no last rites recorded, just one line in red ink beside the entry. Screamed until the stone was set. He returned to the church that night. At 2:13 a.m., the scream returned. Longer, louder. But now, others could hear it. 3 villagers, walking home late, claimed they heard wailing from the roof. 2 altar boys saw the candle flames bend sideways as if pulled toward the floor. And the bell rope, long removed, swung on its own. That week, a man was found dead. Henry Moregrave, 71, a former mason. He had been the one who restored the chapel floor 30 years ago. His body was found outside the church steps, his fingernails torn, dirt beneath his shoes, and in his clenched hand, a folded map, a sketch of the chapel, with one square circled in red. Beneath the altar, Father Brown had seen enough. He broke open the stone himself. The chamber below was real. It was narrow, deep, lined with bones, and in the very center, encased in glass, a skeleton, alone, unblessed, arms folded wrong, and scratched into the lid of the glass. She confessed. No one listened. The bones were female, young, and wrapped around the neck, a rosary with the same crucifix Father Brown wore, identical, but aged, eroded, older than it should be. He took it. The screaming stopped, for one night, then returned louder than ever. He dreamed of her, saw her face, pale, broken, but not angry, desperate. He asked the bishop for permission to rebury the remains. The bishop refused. The next night, the bishop's study burned down. No source of ignition, no lightning, nothing. But beneath the scorched remains was a single line, carved into the desk. He didn't hear her either. Father Brown held the funeral himself. He dug the grave, he spoke the rites. He placed the crucifix on her chest and said her name aloud for the first time, based on a half-burnt ledger page he'd found in the basement. Alessandra. The wind stopped. The church fell silent. For the first time in weeks, there was peace, until the next Mass, when Father Brown stood at the pulpit, opened his Bible, and a scream echoed from the confessional. Everyone heard it, but when they opened the door, it was empty. Only Father Brown knew what the sound had really said. Not a scream, a name, his, not shouted, but spoken with grief. And beneath the seat, a note, one word. Again. He didn't tell the others. He stood alone in the chapel that night, listening. And, when no screams came, he finally spoke aloud. I know who did it. The flame above the altar flickered, but the truth will never be told.